In this video, we'll be talking about antibiotics and vaccines, differentiating between the two when they're used and how they help to give our body a little bit of a boost. So if you want to, on your own time, you can take a look at this video. Again, use your phone camera, scan that QR code to watch a video talking about antibiotics, antivirals, which we will not be focusing on, and vaccines. I'll go ahead and summarize kind of the main differences between them, but the video is a very good simplified version of what I'll be talking about as well. So we can help our immune system using vaccines and antibiotics, but they're different things for different purposes. So vaccines are we take mainly viruses and we kill it, modify it, take a part of it, weaken it, many different options, and we put it into the body to stimulate an active response against that virus. Antibiotics are just chemicals. Think about like Lysol. They're chemicals to kill a certain type of pathogen. Usually vaccines, but not always, are done ahead of time, in advance, to prevent you from getting the virus in the first place. Antibiotics, on the other hand, usually are given after you've gotten sick, and they're used to treat infections, specifically bacteria and fungal infections. Antibiotics have absolutely no effect on viruses. So they can only be used on bacterial or fungal infections. Vaccines will provide lasting immunity via memory cells. But antibiotics, since they are just chemicals, they'll just help to kind of get rid of some of those bacteria or fungus particles, cells, but will not provide you lasting immunity. So what is an antibiotic? Well, we said it's a chemical substance, and it's actually made by other microorganisms. It's produced naturally by bacteria or molds to prevent other bacteria from growing. So in this case here, we have bacteria on what's called a petri dish, and the first antibiotic was discovered accidentally because somebody left their petri dish with bacteria out for the weekend. They came back and they saw this mold growing, and instead of just throwing it away, they recognized that there was this little area around the mold where the bacteria had died. And they tested that and they found that this mold was producing a chemical that killed the bacteria. And they called that penicillin, named for the type of mold that produced this compound. We've taken penicillin and we've made modifications to it and derived different antibiotics from that. Here's a link over here to a video if you want to watch talking about antibiotics, misconceptions that exist surrounding them. So we're going to talk about the resistance to antibiotics that's been developed or that has developed over years, to the point where now it's considered to be one of the top 3 threats to human health by the World Health Organization, leading to tens of thousands of deaths and many illnesses. And it's especially a problem in healthcare settings. So how does antibiotic resistance develop? How does it evolve? Well, there are kind of 4 main steps. First of all, here we have some bacteria, a whole group of them. And maybe one of them, just by random chance, has some resistance to, say, penicillin, a specific antibiotic. The rest don't. Well, now you apply what's called a selective pressure. You're choosing which bacteria are going to die and which are more likely to survive. So most of the normal ones that don't have resistance die. The one that's resistant, though, survives. Then these multiply, they pass on. And if you continue to use antibiotics, the ones that don't have the resistance are going to die more often than the ones that do. Over time, now you have developed a fully resistant strain that will not be killed by that particular antibiotic. And sometimes they can evolve resistance to multiple types of antibiotics, which makes it very difficult to treat. So what can we do? How can we make sure that we're not contributing to the problem? So unfortunately, as long as we're using antibiotics, resistance will develop. But how can we slow down the process? Well, for one, Make sure you're only using antibiotics for proper things. They have no effect on viruses, so don't use them or demand them when it's something that it won't help at all. It may even make you sicker by disrupting your native bacterial flora in your intestines. Make sure you follow the guidelines by doctors, taking the dosage of antibiotics exactly as prescribed. Don't take half as much for a longer period of time. Follow the guidelines. The guidelines are designed to try to kill as many bacteria as possible. Make sure you take your full course of antibiotics. That means if the doctor said to go for 4 weeks, but after 3 weeks you're feeling better, don't stop. Keep going to finish that course. Because what happens is when you're feeling better, you might have a few that have survived inside of you. And if you stop your antibiotics early, they have a better chance of surviving and having some resistance that might have developed. For some things, the expiration date is more of a suggestion. For example, I've had a can of Coca-Cola that was over a year old. Cracked that can open, it tasted the same. With antibiotics, though, they get weaker as time goes on, and so they might be not as effective. So you want to make sure you're using only current antibiotics. And also, don't share your antibiotics with others. Your prescription and dosage is custom tailored for you, and you don't want to have people diagnosing themselves, so make sure you're only using those for yourself. So there's some good news here and some bad news. In terms of antibiotic development, the number of antibiotics licensed you can see here. We had a peak in the 50s and 60s, and it's been relatively low ever since, where vaccines are increasing in terms of the number of new vaccines. So that's the good news. And the bad news is we have less antibiotics available than we used to, especially with some bacteria becoming resistant to them. Again, here's another QR code over in the corner. You can scan that to do an interactive related to vaccination now, which we'll move into. Vaccination is also referred to as immunization. We are exposing yourself to a foreign antigen present as part of a virus usually, and it stimulates your body to produce memory cells, giving you lasting protection. Most of our vaccines are usually made from killed bacteria, viruses, or parts of those. Sometimes there's weakened versions, and it stimulates this protection. So I mentioned before, chickenpox, I got it when I was a kid. The vaccine wasn't available until I was, I think, probably 12 years old or so, and I actually got chickenpox earlier. So I have lasting immunity, but other people may have gotten the vaccine, which also provides them with lasting protection. Now, for those of us like myself who got infected with chickenpox, you have a possibility of developing shingles later on in life. Chickenpox actually belongs to the herpes virus family. See up here? Oops. Chickenpox belongs to the herpes virus. And herpes viruses have a tendency to hide out inside of our nervous system. Our nervous system is mostly off limits to our immune system to protect our immune system, to protect our nervous system from being potentially attacked by mistake by our immune system. And so what happens is this virus hides out here. And later on in life, sometimes it comes back out. It causes what we call shingles, where you get these pustules and blisters that come out and they fill with pus and they burst and crust over. And it happens along a line, usually on one side of your body, because they're coming out along that nerve where the virus was hiding out. And this can cause, pain afterwards. In some cases, if it gets into your eye, it can cause permanent blindness. Luckily, there's a vaccine for shingles that can help to reduce the chance of getting this. But it's best to get the vaccine against chickenpox in the first place, because that will protect you from ever getting shingles, because you didn't get chickenpox in the first place. Let's talk about vaccines used against the respiratory flu, against influenza. So influenza is a virus that likes to inhabit our lungs. Each type of virus has a different preferred location it wants to go into. Influenza goes into the lungs, and it's very contagious. That means it's easily spread from one person to another, usually through coughing or sneezing. And how are they developed against this? Well, the influenza virus is constantly changing. And what that means is that every time you get a flu shot, because the virus is changing, you might need to get a new flu shot to then correspond to this new set of antigens that's encountered each season. So different antigens is changing its appearance, which means that you need a new flu shot each year. How does the flu vaccine work? I'll sometimes say flu shot, but there's a shot. There's also a nasal spray. So the way it works is it introduces these virus strains into your body, but these are dead versions. So it's not possible for these versions to infect. And what happens is your adaptive immune division has responded, and about 2 weeks later, you now have protection against those strains that were included. However, only 3 or 4 strains are included, and they're ones based on research that are likely to be the most common. But they're not always the most common. Sometimes the research makes a mistake, and you have protection against some minor versions. Then you can still get sick when the other versions infect you. Or you can still get sick within that 2-week window before your protection is built up. However, the flu vaccine cannot. It's impossible. 0% chance. It cannot cause the flu. You can get flu-like symptoms, which is often what happens, because you're stimulating your immune response. And those flu-like symptoms are caused by your immune system trying to fight off this harmless version of the virus that's been included in the vaccine. But it cannot cause the flu. Another important thing to note is that the influenza or flu vaccine does not protect you from what we call the stomach flu. They're completely different things. Influenza affects your respiratory system. The stomach flu is a different virus that affects your stomach. So why can't you get a vaccine against what we call the common cold, or just the cold? Well, here's just some information if you want to kind of differentiate between the flu versus the cold. I won't go into that, but here's why. The common cold is actually caused by over 200 different viruses. It's not just one type of virus like influenza is. And also, just like influenza, it's constantly changing. So every time you come down with a cold, it's because you're getting a new version of a virus or a completely new virus that's coming in and infecting you. And so you're immune to the old versions, but the new ones, they're disguised, they get in, and they cause problems. To finish up, we're going to talk here about vaccination and how we've seen a resurgence of certain diseases, especially childhood diseases, that really were at extremely low levels up until recently. And it has to do with some individuals choosing not to vaccinate their children. And we'll talk about why some people might have been doing that, but certain diseases like measles and whooping cough have been making a comeback in the United States due to less vaccination. So we can see here that this is looking at cases of measles since the 1950s. It's still very, very low to pre-vaccination days. So here in 1958, for example, in the United States, 763,000 cases of measles. Crazy amount of measles, down to basically 0. And then now we've been seeing this general increase here over the last 10 years. Over 1,000 cases in 2019, for example. And outbreaks happen mainly in specific communities that have lower rates of vaccination. And we'll talk about why that is. So there's this concept called herd immunity. Let me erase this. I cannot spell today. So herd immunity is looking at this concept of vaccinating most people protects the unvaccinated. talk about why that is in a second. But first of all, there are many reasons why people don't get vaccinated. Either they're too young, so newborn babies, for example, don't get their first vaccines until several months later. Maybe they're too old, or they're immunocompromised. They have a weak immune system, and so they can't get certain vaccines. And so if the majority of us who are healthy get vaccinated, besides protecting ourselves, we also protect those who don't get vaccinated. There's also, of course, religious or other objections to it. This is called herd immunity, because in the left case here, if only a few people get vaccinated, marked here in these kind of yellow-orange color, right? The blue are healthy, not vaccinated. The red here is sick, not vaccinated. It spreads very easily through the majority of that non-vaccinated population. But if most people get vaccinated, it's like a shield against those few here who did not get vaccinated, and less of those will get sick. It helps to protect individuals. This is called herd immunity, like a herd of cows offers protection. So why are some people choosing, or have some people chosen, to not vaccinate their children besides religious objections or ethical objections, I guess, to vaccines? Well, there's this question. Does childhood vaccination cause autism? Well, what is autism? Autism is a spectrum disorder. What that means is there's not one way it manifests itself, but there are many ways. And there are certain common characteristics that individuals with autism often display. One of those is differences in social interaction. So for many of us, we can look at someone's face or their tone of voice and get information from that into how they're feeling. For some individuals with autism, it's very difficult to look at those what we consider normal social cues and pick up on that. And also, we oftentimes see this very narrow range of interests and these repetitive behaviors that develop. Because if you're in a world where you can't make sense of a lot of the nonverbal signals, having structure and repetition is very comforting. And so we see a lot of that. Individuals with autism can go from the very, very high functioning level where, unless they told you, you would have no idea they had autism, to so severe that they might not be able to go to the bathroom by themselves, or can get violent in some cases and even hurt themselves with biting and things like that. So a wide range, a spectrum of things. So many years ago, let's see here in 1998, probably before a number of you were even born, there was a study that came out in this medical journal that suggested there may be a link between the vaccine for measles, mumps, and rubella and autism. Unfortunately, this study had a lot of problems. It was a very small study. The individuals that were chosen for the study were hand-picked. They didn't have a control group, relied on memories, and the conclusions were very questionable. Major studies have been done since then, including one that involved over 1 million children. And all these studies have found that there's no connection between childhood vaccination and autism, absolutely none. The initial study that suggested this possible connection was retracted. The authors were shamed for poor science. And unfortunately, there's still a good chunk of adults who think that childhood vaccinations may cause autism. So you can see here, do you think childhood vaccinations can cause autism? A survey was done. Gray, definitely, probably. And then green, probably or definitely not. So actually, surprisingly, for me at least, younger individuals are more likely to think that there's this connection than the older individuals who definitely grew up with lots of vaccines. One of the difficulties is we don't know what causes autism. We do know that there's not a single cause. There's a variety of factors that seem to be involved, but we're still not sure the specific reason. And also, autism is on the increase. Either we're just diagnosing it more, or it's actually increasing. But approximately 1 in 68 U.S. children are placed on the autism spectrum disorder, somewhere on that spectrum. And it's much more common for boys, 1 in 42, than for girls. And again, we don't know why that is. We do know that vaccines do not cause autism.